The scanner had already cleared over 200 cadets without a single issue. Just names, species, clearance levels, all routine, all boring. Until the line stalled in front of one human and the screen changed in a way no one expected. No green light, no warning tone. Just one word, cold and final, hanging in the air for everyone to see: Deathworlder. The room didn't erupt, it froze, because that label wasn't supposed to show up at an academy like this. If you like stories where humans walk into places they were never meant to survive and somehow rewrite the rules, stick around, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you think happens when the galaxy finally realizes who we really are. The line moved forward in slow, disciplined steps, boots tapping against the polished floor of the Galactic Combat Academy, a place built to intimidate before training even began. This was where the strongest species in known space sent their best, where gravity fields shifted without warning and the air itself felt heavier, tuned to remind everyone that weakness was not tolerated here. The human cadet felt it too, the pressure, the stares, the quiet assumptions, but he kept his face neutral as the scanner arm slid over each recruit ahead of him, flashing green again and again. Species confirmed. Survivability index acceptable. Threat level manageable. The whispers were casual at first, bored even, because humans were rare but not unheard of. Usually logistics officers or technicians, never frontline material, never combat cadets worth remembering. When it was finally his turn, the scanner hesitated. Not long, just a fraction of a second, but long enough for trained eyes to notice. The hum deepened, the light shifted from green to a muted amber, and the low chime echoed through the hall, cutting through the background noise like a blade. Conversations died instantly. The instructor overseeing intake straightened, one clawed, hand resting near the shock baton at his side, eyes narrowing as the scanner recalibrated itself. Data streamed across the display faster now, lines of symbols translating, cross-referencing, digging deeper than it ever had for the others. The word appeared slowly, letter by letter, as if the system itself was reluctant to commit. Deathworlder. It hung there in stark white against a black field, unblinking, undeniable. A ripple passed through the assembled cadets. Not panic, not fear exactly, but something closer to instinctive caution, like prey realizing too late that a predator had entered the space. A few stepped back without thinking. Others leaned forward, curiosity warring with centuries of ingrained warnings. Deathworlders were myths to some, cautionary tales to others, species that evolved under brutal conditions and survived, not through elegance or technology, but through stubborn refusal to die. The human felt the shift immediately. The air around him seemed to change, not physically, but socially, like an invisible line had been drawn, and everyone else was suddenly on the other side of it. He lifted his gaze from the floor and met the instructor's eyes, calm, steady, not defiant, but not apologetic either. He had grown up hearing what humans were called in off-world reports, how their planets were cataloged as unstable, their biology flagged as excessive, their psychology marked unpredictable. He had also grown up learning to work twice as hard, just to be taken half as seriously. The instructor finally broke the silence, voice low and controlled, asking the scanner to confirm. It did. Again. Louder this time. Deathworlder, designation verified. Environmental resilience extreme. Combat adaptation probability high. That last line drew murmurs, sharper now, edged with something uneasy. The Academy prided itself on control, on knowing exactly what it was shaping. And the idea that something here might adapt beyond prediction unsettled more than a few veterans watching from the upper levels. The human exhaled slowly, not because he was nervous, but because this was the moment he had expected since he applied. There would be no blending in now, no quiet passing through training. Whatever happened next would define him in the eyes of the Academy and possibly the galaxy beyond it. He stepped forward when instructed, posture relaxed, shoulders loose, the way he had learned back home, on a planet where storms could level cities and creatures evolved to hunt anything slower than them. Around him, the whispers returned, sharper, more focused, carrying a single unspoken question that lingered in the air long after the scanner powered down. What exactly had they just let in? They moved him out of line without ceremony, not roughly, but deliberately, like technicians isolating a variable in an experiment. 2 Academy officers flanked him as he walked, their strides measured, eyes forward, pretending this was routine, even though everyone in the hall could feel it was not. Behind them, the intake process resumed, scanners humming, green lights flashing, but the rhythm felt off now, like a song played half a beat too slow. Every cadet left in line watched the human's back as he was escorted toward a secondary chamber, some with open interest, others with thinly veiled concern. Because Deathworlder was not just a classification, it was a warning label passed down through generations. The chamber they led him into was smaller, circular, walls lined with adaptive panels that shifted color in response to movement and biosignatures. This was not a punishment room, nor a holding cell. It was an evaluation space, the kind reserved for unknowns. The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss, and for a brief moment he was alone, the hum of hidden machinery the only sound. He rolled, his shoulders once loosening tension, grounding himself the way his first instructor on Earth had taught him. Breathe, assess, adapt. Whatever test was coming, panic would only make it worse. The panels brightened, resolving into observation windows as figures appeared behind them. Instructors, analysts, military advisors from allied species, all pretending they were not staring directly at him. Data scrolled across their displays: gravity tolerance, muscle density, neural response speed, atmospheric survivability. Numbers that meant little on their own but told a very specific story when combined. One of them muttered something about baseline human metrics being outdated. Another countered that no one survived a death world long without changes, natural or otherwise. A voice filled the chamber, amplified but calm, belonging to the intake commander, a tall avian species known for surgical precision in both combat and speech. He asked the human to state his name, his origin, his reason for enrolling. The questions were standard, but the tone was not. This was not curiosity for curiosity's sake. This was assessment under uncertainty. A human answered plainly, giving his name, his home world, the kind of planet that barely registered on most galactic maps except as a footnote marked high gravity, unstable climate, extreme biodiversity. When asked why he was here, he did not give a speech. He said he wanted to learn how to fight alongside others instead of alone. That answer caused more reaction than any statistic. A few observers leaned closer to their screens. Cooperative intent from a Deathworlder was not unheard of, but it was rare enough to warrant note. Most species that evolved under constant threat learned isolation first, trust later, if at all. The commander paused, then instructed the system to begin live calibration. The floor beneath the human shifted, gravity subtly increasing, not enough to pin him, but enough to test instinct. He adjusted without thinking, stance widening, knees flexing, muscles compensating in smooth, efficient motions that made several analysts exchange looks. The system pushed further. Environmental parameters fluctuated, air density changing, light levels dimming and brightening, simulated stressors designed to provoke hesitation. The human's pulse rose, but his breathing stayed controlled. He was not fighting the environment. He was moving with it, letting his body do what it had been shaped to do over a lifetime of adaptation. Somewhere behind the glass, a quiet alarm. chimed, not an error, but a flag. Behavioral response exceeding predicted curve. When the test finally eased, the chamber returned to neutral and the voice spoke again. This time, with something new beneath the professionalism. Interest. The commander informed him that his intake process would continue separately, that his designation came with additional observation, additional risk, and additional expectations. Failure would not be tolerated. Success would be monitored closely. The human nodded once, accepting terms he had known were coming the moment the scanner paused. As the door opened to escort him deeper into the academy, one thought settled firmly in his mind, clear and steady. They were watching him now, not as a curiosity, but as a potential problem. And on a death world, being underestimated had always been the most dangerous mistake someone could make. They did not take him back to the intake hall. Instead, the corridor angled downward, deeper into the academy's core, where the walls grew thicker and the air felt denser, tuned for species that preferred pressure over comfort. The human noticed immediately the way his footsteps sounded heavier here, the way each breath carried more resistance. It was subtle, but intentional. This level was not meant for newcomers, and certainly not for those who were expected to fail quickly. That alone told him something important. The academy had not decided what to do with him yet. The escort finally stopped at a reinforced door marked with a symbol he did not recognize, sharp angles intersecting around a central void. When it opened, the space beyond was vast, far larger than the intake chambers above. Training platforms floated at different heights, some rotating slowly, others locked in place, and between them stretched open air filled with faintly glowing particulate matter that mapped movement and force. This was a live combat assessment arena, not a classroom, and as soon as he stepped inside, he felt eyes on him again, not from behind glass this time, but from the edges of the room itself. Other cadets were already present. Not many, maybe a dozen, each clearly separated by species and capability. Some were massive, plated in natural armor, others thin and angular, bodies optimized for speed or precision. None of them looked relaxed. This was not a standard drill. This was a sorting ground, where the academy decided who trained together and who did not. The human took his assigned position on a mid-level platform and waited, resisting the urge to stretch or test the footing, choosing stillness instead. On Earth, stillness had often been the smartest move before chaos. An instructor entered the arena without announcement, dropping from above and landing with a controlled impact that sent a visible ripple through the particulate field. The figure was tall, broad, and unmistakably dangerous, a veteran whose presence alone shifted the energy in the room. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. His gaze moved from cadet to cadet, lingering for half a second longer on the human, just long enough to acknowledge the designation that had followed him here. The rules were simple and not explained. Survive the evaluation. Adapt to the environment. Do not endanger the infrastructure. Everything else was permitted. With a single gesture from the instructor, the arena came alive. Platforms began to move, gravity vectors shifting unpredictably, forcing the cadets into motion whether they were ready or not. The human reacted on instinct, knees bending, balance adjusting as his platform tilted, body already calculating trajectories and distances without conscious thought. The first engagement was not aimed at him, but he saw it anyway. A heavily built cadet lunging at a smaller, faster one, misjudging speed and getting thrown off balance by a sudden gravity flip. The human clocked the timing. The way the field changed just before the platform moved, filed it away. Patterns mattered. They always did. When his own platform accelerated sideways, he did not panic or grab for stability. He stepped into the motion, letting momentum carry him, using the shift to launch himself cleanly onto a neighboring surface. That was when someone noticed. A sleek, multi-limbed cadet redirected mid-leap, targeting him directly, likely seeing the human as an easy variable to remove. The attack was fast and sharp, designed to overwhelm with angles rather than strength. The human met it head-on, not with force, but with timing, slipping inside the strike, redirecting a limb just enough to break balance, and using the shared gravity well to send the attacker spinning away. It was efficient, controlled, and over far too quickly for the observers to dismiss his luck. The instructor's attention sharpened. This was not brute survival. This was learned adaptation layered on top of natural resilience. As the arena continued to shift and cadets clashed across moving platforms, one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. The human was not reacting late. He was reacting early, anticipating changes before they fully manifested, moving as if he belonged in an environment that was supposed to break him dead by the time the first phase of the evaluation ended. Several cadets were already down, restrained by the field for safety. The human remained standing, breathing steady, eyes scanning, posture loose but ready. Somewhere above, unseen systems updated probabilities, and the word Deathworlder took on a weight it had not carried when it first appeared on the scanner. The arena did not reset when the first phase ended. That alone made several cadets tense. Platforms stayed in motion, gravity vectors kept shifting, and the particulate field thickened, glowing brighter as if the system itself was leaning in. This was not a pause. It was escalation. The instructor raised one hand and the restraints around the fallen cadets disengaged. But instead of allowing them to leave, the arena repositioned them onto distant platforms, injured but conscious, forced to remain observers. Whatever was coming next was meant to be seen. The instructor finally spoke, his voice carrying without amplification, calm and heavy, like it had been tempered by years of chaos. Phase 2 will test cooperative survival under hostile conditions. Translation rippled across the displays a half-second later. Cooperation was a loaded word here. Most species trained in hierarchies, dominance chains, or rigid formations. Humans, the instructor suspected, did something different. The human. Cadet lifted his head slightly at the word, not in relief, but in focus. Cooperation meant variables. Variables meant opportunity. The environment shifted again, hotter this time. Sections of the arena darkened as artificial night swept across half the platforms. Temperature dropped unevenly, creating thermal pockets that distorted vision and balance. Simulated hazards activated without warning. Bursts of force, directional shockwaves, pulses meant to disorient rather than injure. Immediately, cadets began clustering with their own kind, instinct pulling them toward familiarity. The human did not. He moved toward the nearest isolated cadet instead, a tall avian species struggling to maintain altitude in the shifting gravity. He did not speak. He did not gesture wildly. He simply positioned himself where the next shockwave would hit, braced, and took the impact first, allowing the avian to stabilize behind him. It was a small act, almost unremarkable, but it created space. Space allowed thinking. The avian recovered, adjusted wing orientation, and together they moved, not as a unit bound by command, but as two individuals reading the same danger and reacting in parallel. Others noticed. A scaled cadet adjusted course to align with them. Then another, then two more from entirely different evolutionary lines. There was no leader announced, no signal given, yet a loose cluster formed around the human's movement. Not because he was strongest, but because he was readable. His actions made sense. On a death world, clarity was survival. The instructor watched this unfold without interference, his interest sharpening into something closer to concern. The arena responded. New threats activated, not random now, but targeted. Gravity wells formed to separate the cluster, environmental effects stacking to overwhelm shared movement. The human adapted again, breaking formation before it could be forced apart, redirecting individuals towards safer vectors, trusting they would understand. They did. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. The cluster survived where others fractured, and fractures were punished quickly by the system. When the phase ended at last, the arena lights rose slowly, revealing a field of exhausted cadets and scorched platforms. The human leaned forward slightly, hands on his knees, breathing controlled but deep. Around him stood others who had started the phase alone and ended it alive. The instructor stepped forward, gaze no longer neutral. This was not just endurance. This was influence. Above them, new data compiled quietly, linking the Deathworlder designation to something the Academy had not formally categorized before. Not just survivability, not just aggression, but adaptive leadership under chaos. And that was far more dangerous than strength alone. The debrief chamber was colder than the arena, not in temperature but in intent. Smooth metallic walls reflected light without warmth, and the air carried that sterile stillness used in places where truth was meant to be extracted, not discussed. Cadets stood in assigned positions, spaced deliberately far enough to prevent whispered exchanges. Medical drones drifted between them, scanning, repairing, recording. No one spoke. They were all waiting for the verdict that would decide whether what they had just survived was considered success or failure. The human stood near the back, posture relaxed in a way that unsettled those who noticed it. Not careless, not arrogant, just familiar with the feeling of aftermath. On his world, survival was rarely followed by celebration. It was followed by preparation for whatever came next. A translucent screen ignited above the chamber floor, displaying performance metrics in cascading columns. Species, averages, individual, deviations, anomalies flagged in sharp crimson. The room reacted when one anomaly stayed on screen longer than the rest. The human's identifier pulsed once, then expanded, data unfolding in layers that did not usually exist for a first cycle. Cadet. Stress tolerance far above baseline. Improvisational response patterns exceeding predictive models. Cooperative efficiency spike under non-hierarchical conditions. Several instructors exchanged glances. This was not an error. The system did not make these kinds of mistakes without reason. The lead instructor stepped forward, claws clicking softly against the floor, and addressed the chamber. Phase 2 results indicate a significant deviation from expected outcomes. His eyes did not leave the human as he spoke. Most cadets avoided attention, shoulders tightening, mandibles still, wings folded tight. The human met the gaze without challenge, without submission, just presence. That, more than the numbers, sent a ripple of unease through the observers. One instructor broke protocol and spoke quietly, though the microphones caught it anyway. If they scale like this under pressure, what happens in a live conflict? No one answered. The question was not rhetorical. It was a warning wrapped in curiosity. The Academy trained soldiers, strategists, explorers. It did not train destabilizing variables. And yet, here one stood, breathing steadily, unaware that entire threat models were being rewritten in real time. The verdict came without ceremony. Advancement to Phase 3. A collective exhale moved through the room, but it did not reach everyone. For some, relief turned to dread. Phase 3 was not about survival or cooperation. It was about decision-making under irreversible consequence. Simulated war ethics, command authority, sacrifice calculations. The kind of tests where instincts revealed more than training ever could. As the cadets were dismissed, the human turned to leave like the rest, but a subtle shift in the lighting caught his attention. A private channel request blinked briefly on the edge of his vision, tagged with a clearance level far above his own. It vanished before he could respond. Across the chamber, the lead instructor watched him go, mind already racing ahead to scenarios the Academy had hoped never to test, because the scanner had not been wrong. Deathworlder was not a warning label. It was a forecast. Phase 3 did not begin with alarms or announcements. It began with silence so complete it felt artificial, the kind of quiet engineered to make minds restless. The cadets were guided into individual simulation pods, each one a sealed chamber, lined with adaptive neural interfaces and atmospheric controls. No teams this time. No shared objectives. The Academy wanted to see what each mind did when there was no one else to lean on, no hierarchy to obey, and no clear definition of what success even meant. The human entered his pod without hesitation. The door sealed behind him, and the world dissolved into darkness before rebuilding itself piece by piece. He found himself standing on the edge of a fractured settlement, structures half collapsed, smoke hanging low in the air, distant cries cutting through the haze. The system fed him contextual data in a neutral tone. Civilian population present. Hostile force approaching. Evacuation window limited. Resources insufficient for full extraction. This was not a battle scenario. This was a choice scenario, almost. Immediately, the system began to watch for the expected responses. Prioritization algorithms predicted he would attempt to maximize survival percentages, calculate losses, choose the least catastrophic option. That was how most species approached these tests. The human did none of that at first. He stood still, eyes moving, taking in the pattern of damage, the flow of smoke, the way the cries echoed off broken walls. He was mapping emotion as much as terrain. When he finally moved, it was not toward the obvious evacuation routes. He headed deeper into the settlement, toward the most unstable structures where the cries were weakest. The system flagged the decision as inefficient. Structural collapse probability was high. Time cost unacceptable. Yet he continued, dragging debris aside with raw physical effort, guiding non-combatants through narrow gaps, sealing breaches with whatever materials he could find. He did not try to save everyone. He tried to save the ones directly in front of him. As the hostile force closed in, the simulation escalated. Enemy units appeared on rooftops, firing suppressive rounds. The system offered him command access, the ability to call in limited support assets if he chose to abandon the civilians. Most cadets did. Most took the authority and retreated, justifying the losses with strategic language. The human ignored the offer. He set traps instead, collapsing access points, redirecting enemies into choke points that slowed them without direct engagement. Violence was a last resort, not a reflex. In the observation chamber, analysts leaned forward. This behavior did not fit cleanly into doctrine. He was not acting like a soldier or a commander. He was acting like something older, protective, stubborn, the kind of mindset forged on a world where disaster was not theoretical and survival was often personal. The final escalation came without warning. A child appeared in the simulation, separated, trapped behind a barrier that would fail within seconds. The system waited for the breaking point. Calculations showed that retrieving the child would reduce overall survival metrics below acceptable thresholds. The human did not hesitate. He ran. The barrier collapsed as he reached it, debris striking him hard enough to trigger pain feedback. That dropped other cadets to their knees. He shielded the child, dragged them clear, and collapsed moments later as the simulation ended. The pod opened to reveal him breathing hard, face marked with stress indicators, body shaking from residual adrenaline. Around him, other pods opened with cadets who looked relieved, shaken, or emotionally distant. The human looked none of those things. He looked angry. Not at the system, not at the outcome, but at the fact that a choice like that had been turned into a test dot in the observation chamber. The silence returned, heavier than before. One analyst finally spoke, voice low and tight. He failed the metrics. The lead instructor did not look away from the data stream still scrolling in red and gold. No, he said quietly. He failed our expectations. And that might be far more dangerous. Somewhere, deep in the Academy's core systems, a new flag activated. Not a warning, a contingency. The results of Phase 3 were not announced. They never were. Instead, the Academy allowed the tension to spread on its own, feeding rumors through silence and letting imagination do the rest. Cadets returned to shared quarters with no scores. No rankings, and no indication of who had advanced or failed. For most species, that uncertainty was worse than bad news. For the human, it barely registered. His body ached from the simulation feedback, but his mind was already replaying the choices, not to justify them, but to see where he could have done better. That night, sleep came in fragments. The Academy adjusted environmental cycles to induce rest, but human neurology did not always cooperate. When he finally drifted off, it was not into dreams of combat or victory, but into half-formed memories of storms, evacuation drills, and voices telling him to move faster, carry lighter, decide. Now, he woke before the cycle bell, sitting upright, heart racing, the feeling of being watched crawling along his spine. He was not wrong. Across the station, in a sector no cadet was cleared to enter, senior staff gathered around a projection that showed his simulation run in slow motion. They were not watching the rescues or the tactical improvisation. They were focused on micro-decisions, on moments measured in milliseconds where he chose risk over safety, responsibility over efficiency. One analyst pointed to a data spike. Here, no hesitation. Pain threshold exceeded species norms by a factor of 4. Emotional load increasing, but no cognitive degradation. That is not training, another replied. That is conditioning. The word hung in the air. Conditioning implied origin, environment, a world that did not allow soft failures, a world where mistakes cost lives, not scores. The scanner label echoed again in their minds, not as a category, but as a warning. Deathworlder. Back. In the cadet wing, the human noticed a shift in how others looked at him. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Some gazes held curiosity, others fear, a few something close to respect. One cadet, tall and scaled, finally broke the silence. At simulation, he said carefully, "Why did you go back for the last?" 1. You knew the numbers did not work. The human considered the question, then shrugged. Because they were there. The answer confused more than it clarified. Several cadets exchanged glances, clearly searching for a strategic explanation that was not coming. To them, every action had to serve an outcome. To him, some actions simply existed because not taking them was unacceptable. The shift became official the next day. Cadets were summoned not to a training hall, but to the primary auditorium. This alone was unprecedented. The lead instructor stood before them, posture rigid, eyes sweeping the room. Phase 4, he announced, will not test your bodies or your tactics. It will test something far more difficult to measure: loyalty. A ripple of unease moved through the ranks. Teams were reassigned without explanation. Species that rarely worked together were paired. Rivals were placed side by side. The human found himself assigned to a unit where he was the only one of his kind, surrounded by cadets who still did not know whether to trust him or fear him. The instructor's gaze lingered on him for a fraction longer than the rest. Understand this? The instructor continued. In the coming exercise, success is not individual. Failure, however, will be very personal. As the cadets filed out, the human felt it again, that pressure. Not gravity this time, but intent. Whatever Phase 4 was, it was not designed to see if they could work together. It was designed to see who they would choose when things went wrong. And somewhere deep in the Academy's systems, the contingency flag pulsed brighter, quietly preparing for a future no one in that room was ready to face. Phase 4 did not begin with alarms or instructions. It began with separation. The cadets were escorted into what appeared to be a decommissioned sector of the station. Corridors dimmer, walls scarred with old impacts that no one had bothered to repair. There were no briefing screens, no tactical overlays. Only a simple directive delivered through wrist units, telling each team to proceed forward and adapt. The lack of structure immediately unsettled most of them. They had been trained to expect parameters, wind conditions, limits. This felt different, deliberately vague, as if the Academy itself was stepping back to watch what would happen when guidance was removed. The human felt the tension rise in his team almost immediately. Voices overlapping, questions stacking on top of one another. Everyone waiting for someone else to take control. As they moved deeper, the station began to change. Around them, bulkheads sealed without warning, forcing detours. Gravity fluctuated just enough to disrupt balance. Environmental controls cycled unpredictably, heat bleeding into cold, air thinning, and then stabilizing again. It was not overtly dangerous, but it was exhausting. The kind of stress that eroded cooperation inch by inch. One of the cadets accused. Another of triggering a trap. Another suggested splitting up to cover more ground. The human listened, said little, watching how quickly frustration turned into blame. When the first simulated casualty occurred, a hard light construct slamming into one teammate and locking them in a stasis field, the argument stopped and something colder took its place. They could leave the downed cadet behind. The system made that clear. A route opened that would allow the remaining members to continue with minimal delay. The human stepped toward the stasis field without hesitation, already scanning for a manual release. A sharp voice cut in, warning him that intervention would slow them, that Phase 4 was about loyalty to the mission, not to individuals. He paused, not because he agreed, but because he was trying to understand the test. This was not about saving one teammate. It was about showing the Academy where the line was, how far they could push before cohesion broke. He made his choice. Anyway, he always did. The delay cost them. More obstacles triggered. Another cadet faltered, stress responses spiking, decision-making degrading. The human shifted roles without announcing it, redistributing tasks, taking on the physical strain. Himself while quietly simplifying choices for the others. He did not frame it as leadership. He framed it as necessity. By the time they reached the extraction zone, battered and behind schedule, they had lost 2 simulated teammates, but had refused to abandon either. The final barrier opened slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the system itself was reconsidering what it had expected to see. They were met not by instructors, but by silence. No debrief, no immediate judgment. Just a return to quarters and a notification that evaluations were ongoing. That was when the weight of it settled in. The Academy was not testing whether they could follow orders. It was testing whether they would rewrite them under pressure, whether they would accept efficiency at the cost of each other. In a facility built to produce officers who could command fleets, the most unsettling outcome was not failure. It was a human cadet who consistently chose people over protocols and still succeeded. Somewhere above the cadet decks, a private channel opened between senior staff and an external authority that rarely intervened. Data packets were transmitted, flagged with escalating priority. The designation Deathworlder appeared again, this time accompanied by a secondary note that had never been officially recognized before. Potential catalyst. As the channel closed, one of the observers leaned back and exhaled slowly. The Academy had wanted to know what humans would do under pressure. Now it had to consider a far more dangerous question. What would happen if others started following their lead? Phase 5 arrived without ceremony, but everyone felt the shift. Where earlier trials had tested skill, cooperation, and restraint, this one stripped away the illusion that the Academy was a controlled environment. The cadets were summoned to a briefing chamber they had never used before, smaller, enclosed, no viewing gallery, no visible instructors. A single projection hovered in the center, displaying fragmented star maps and mission parameters that refused to lock into a single narrative. The message was clear without being spoken. This was no longer about training for hypothetical scenarios. This was about preparing for realities the Academy did not publicly acknowledge. The human noticed how the room reacted to the information. Posture tightening, breathing changing, instinct surfacing beneath layers of discipline. Fear did not come from danger alone. It came from realizing you were being prepared for something real. Teams were reassigned deliberately, separating familiar bonds, forcing cadets to rely on strangers, some of whom had openly expressed distrust. Toward Deathworlders in earlier phases, the human was placed under the command of a non-human cadet known for strict adherence to doctrine, someone who believed deviation was weakness. Their first exchange was stiff, polite on the surface, edged underneath. Orders were issued rapidly, cleanly, leaving no room for debate. The mission simulation unfolded across multiple systems at once. Cascading failures, civilian evacuation priorities, hostile unknowns, incomplete intelligence. It was chaos by design, not to overwhelm, but to see which cadets clung to procedure. When procedure stopped working, as pressure mounted, fractures appeared. The commander hesitated, cycling through protocol trees that no longer matched the situation. The human watched critical seconds bleed away, alarms stacking, casualty projections rising. When he finally spoke, it was not a challenge, not a mutiny, but a suggestion delivered with calm urgency, reframing the problem in human terms rather than abstract metrics. Protect the vulnerable first. Reduce variables. Accept losses that cannot be prevented and focus on those that can. The room seemed to hold its breath. The commander rejected the input initially, citing chain of command, but the next data spike forced a decision, and reluctantly, the plan shifted. The results were immediate. Simulated losses stabilized. Resource allocation improved. The team moved not faster, but smarter, adapting instead of reacting. The commander began asking questions instead of issuing commands, and without anyone naming it, authority redistributed itself naturally. By the time the scenario concluded, the outcome defied Academy projections. Not optimal, not perfect, but survivable, sustainable, human. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. The commander avoided the human's gaze, not out of anger, but because something deeply ingrained had been challenged. Later, alone in his quarters, the human received a notification that did not appear on standard channels. No insignia, no sender identification, just a brief acknowledgement that his performance had triggered off record review. He understood the implication immediately. This was no longer about graduating. This was about being watched. Somewhere beyond the Academy, entities were recalibrating their understanding of what humans brought to interstellar command. Not brute strength, not endurance alone, but a way of making decisions that bent systems without breaking them. As the station drifted through silent space, one truth became unavoidable. The scanner had labeled him Deathworlder as a warning. The Academy was beginning to realize it might be a blueprint. The next cycle began with an announcement that rippled through the Academy faster than any alarm. Phase 6 would not be graded. There would be no scores, no rankings, no public evaluations. Success would not be defined, and failure would not be explained. That alone unsettled the cadets more than any previous trial. The academy had always relied on structure, on measurable outcomes, on hierarchies that made sense. Removing that framework felt like removing gravity. The humans sensed immediately that this phase was not designed to test what they could do, but who they were when no one told them what mattered. They were deployed in staggered intervals, not as teams but as individuals, each placed into isolated operational environments with limited communication and incomplete context. The human found himself in a simulated frontier settlement, small, underdeveloped, barely protected, populated by digital civilians whose behavioral patterns felt uncomfortably real. The threat was undefined. It did not announce itself with hostile markers or incoming fire. It crept in through scarcity, misinformation, and fear. Supplies ran low. Conflicting reports spread through the settlement. Authority figures contradicted one another. Every decision carried consequences that could not be immediately measured. Other cadets approached the scenario tactically, attempting to identify an enemy that could be neutralized. The human took a different path, not because he believed there was no enemy, but because he understood that sometimes survival depended on preventing collapse rather than winning a fight. He organized civilian labor, stabilized food distribution, established communication routines, and made himself visible, present, accountable. He absorbed anger that was not his fault and uncertainty that had no solution. When unrest threatened to turn violent, he did not suppress it. He redirected it, giving people roles, purpose, a sense of control in a situation designed to strip. In a way, observers, unseen and unannounced, began flagging anomalies in the data. The simulation did not escalate as predicted. Stress indicators plateaued. Civilian compliance increased without coercion. Loss projections declined not because the human eliminated a threat, but because the threat failed to fully manifest. When the external trigger finally arrived, a coordinated assault meant to overwhelm the settlement. It found a population already unified, already prepared, already resilient. The defense held not through superior firepower, but through coordination. And trust thought when extraction came, it was abrupt. No debrief. No confirmation of outcome. Just a return to the academy corridors that now felt narrower, more watchful. Other cadets avoided the human, not out of hostility, but because something about his presence unsettled them. He had not played the game the way they were taught. He had not optimized for metrics that mattered to the academy. And yet, somehow, the system had bent around him. That night, a restricted council convened beyond the cadet sectors. Screens displayed aggregated results from Phase 6, and one file remained open longer than the others. A single annotation scrolled beneath it, written in a language reserved for internal doctrine. Human subject demonstrates emergent leadership under non-adversarial threat conditions. Recommendation: reassess Deathworlder classification parameters. Potential risk: misinterpretation of strength as aggression. The Academy had trained for centuries to survive the galaxy. It was only now beginning to understand that humans might survive it in ways no one else had considered. The reassessment did not happen publicly. It never did. The Academy's greatest changes were always made in silence, buried under procedural language and sealed review boards. The cadets were told Phase 6 was complete and that final evaluations were pending, but the tone had shifted. Instructors spoke more carefully now. Automated systems paused longer before issuing commands. Even the architecture seemed to respond differently, lighting adjusting subtly when the human passed, sensors recalibrating as if unsure what parameters to apply. Training resumed, but it no longer felt like progression. It felt like observation. Exercises repeated with minor variations, not to push limits, but to see how cadets adapted when the rules changed without warning. The human noticed it immediately. Objectives were vague. Success conditions contradictory. Authority figures gave instructions that conflicted with academy doctrine. It was a stress test disguised as routine, designed to provoke compliance or fracture. Many cadets struggled. Some shut down. Others doubled down on rigid interpretation, clinging to structure as it slipped away. The human did neither. He asked questions when permitted and acted when answers did not come. He documented inconsistencies, not to challenge authority, but to understand intent. When faced with conflicting orders, he chose the path that minimized harm, even if it meant delaying action. That choice alone generated more internal flags than any previous act of defiance. The academy had systems for aggression, rebellion, even insubordination. It had none for principled restraint. During a joint exercise, a non-human cadet faltered under pressure, overwhelmed by cascading directives and system lag. The protocol response was removal. The human intervened, not physically, but procedurally, rerouting tasks, redistributing load, stabilizing the situation long enough for the cadet to recover. The system logged it as unauthorized interference. The outcome, however, showed improved mission integrity. That contradiction forced a manual review. Behind closed doors, instructors argued. Some saw a dangerous precedent, a cadet who acted outside command hierarchy and succeeded. Others saw a solution to problems the academy had normalized for centuries. The Deathworlder classification was meant to warn of volatility, not adaptability. And yet the data was clear. Where others optimized for survival under pressure, the human optimized for collective endurance. Whispers spread through the cadet ranks. Not admiration, not exactly. Curiosity edged with unease. The word Deathworlder began to change tone. It was no longer just a label of danger. It became shorthand for unpredictability, for outcomes that refused to follow models. Some avoided the human. Others sought proximity, hoping proximity might offer insight or protection. He noticed both and trusted neither. At the end of the cycle, a summons arrived, direct and unfiltered. Attendance mandatory. No rank specified. No purpose given. The chamber was one few cadets ever saw, reserved for doctrinal review and threat evaluation. As the doors sealed behind him, the human felt it again, that subtle shift in pressure, not physical, but institutional. This was not another test. This was the academy deciding what to do with something it could no longer categorize. Across the chamber, a council of species watched in silence. One display illuminated with a single word enlarged, stripped of context. Deathworlder. Then, beneath it, a new line began to form, slow, deliberate, as if even the system hesitated before writing. What came next? The council did not speak at first. They rarely did when something truly unfamiliar stood before them. Silence was their way of forcing patterns to emerge, of seeing whether the subject would fill the void with fear, defiance, or submission. The human stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, posture neutral, not because he was calm, but because he had learned that stillness made observers reveal themselves faster. The word Deathworlder hovered above him, and beneath it the new line. Finished rendering, behavioral anomaly confirmed, adaptive authority elevated, classification under review. That final phrase unsettled the chamber more than any hostile act could have. Classification under review meant the system itself had lost confidence, and for an institution built on categorization, that was a quiet crisis. One of the senior counselors finally leaned forward, a tall avian form with feathers patterned in ceremonial fractals, voice filtered and precise. The question was simple, almost disappointingly so. Why did you interfere? Not how. not what protocol you violated. Why? Duh. Human answered without pause, not because he had rehearsed it, but because the answer had never been complicated. Because the goal was to finish the exercise with everyone still functional, and removing him would have failed that goal. A murmur rippled through the council. That answer sidestepped doctrine entirely. It did not challenge authority. It rendered authority irrelevant by reframing purpose. Another counselor projected data, layered simulations showing projected outcomes if similar decisions were made across fleet operations. Risk increased in some areas, yes, but collapse rates dropped sharply. Mission failure due to cascading stress declined. Casualty projections fell outside expected tolerances, not higher, but lower. The human had not optimized for victory. He had optimized for continuation. That distinction was subtle, but it cut deep. Galactic strategy had long been built around acceptable loss. Humanity, it seemed, had a different definition of acceptable. The discussion shifted then, not about the human, but about Deathworlders. As a concept, the classification was designed to flag species from high-pressure environments, high aggression, high mortality worlds. It assumed that survival bred dominance or brutality. What it had not accounted for was resilience through cooperation, adaptability through contradiction. Earth had not produced a conqueror standing in this chamber. It had produced a systems, thinker forged by chaos. The Council realized, uncomfortably, that they had been scanning for the wrong threat. When the human was dismissed, escorted not by guards but by attendants, the Academy buzzed with quiet speculation. Cadets noticed the change immediately. Training modules updated overnight. New parameters appeared. Exercises emphasized ambiguity, moral pressure, incomplete information. These were not designed for most species. They were designed to see who could operate the way the human did, without breaking. Many could not. Some resented him for it, blaming his presence for the sudden difficulty. Others watched closely, copying his habits, his pauses, the way he listened before acting. Late that cycle, a private message reached his terminal, unmarked by origin. It contained no threat, no praise, only a statement. Your classification will not be changed. It will be expanded. Beneath it, a single line of explanation. The Academy does not adapt easily, but the galaxy must. The humans stared at the words longer than necessary. Expansion meant responsibility. It meant expectation. It meant that whatever came next would not just be about surviving the Academy. It would be about redefining what survival meant for everyone watching. The changes did not announce themselves with alarms or declarations. They arrived quietly, the way all truly dangerous shifts did. Training schedules adjusted by minutes instead of hours. Evaluation criteria gained new subclauses that no one could quite explain. Instructors stopped giving direct corrections and started asking questions instead. The kind that lingered uncomfortably in the mind long after the exercise ended. The Academy was testing something now, not just the cadets, but its own assumptions. And the human could feel it in the way eyes tracked him differently, not with hostility, not even curiosity, but calculation. In the next multi-species exercise, the difference became impossible to ignore. The scenario was framed as a standard extraction under hostile environmental conditions. Unstable gravity, partial sensor blindness, simulated biological threat. Most cadets reacted as expected, securing their own positions first, establishing defensive perimeters, waiting for optimal conditions. The human did none of that. He moved early, not fast, but decisively, reading the way others hesitated, predicting bottlenecks before they formed. When a Krell unit froze under conflicting commands, he did not override them. He stepped into their line of sight and redefined the objective in simpler terms. Get everyone out alive. We adjust after. The Krell followed, not because of rank, but because the instruction reduced uncertainty. The system logged the result as an anomaly again. Extraction success exceeded baseline projections by 30%. Stress casualties dropped to 0. That was when the resentment surfaced openly. A cadet from a high hierarchy species confronted him after the exercise, voice tight with controlled anger, accusing him of bending rules that had worked for centuries. The human listened, really listened, then replied with a question instead of a defense. How many centuries ago were those rules written, and how many environments have changed since? The cadet had no answer, only frustration. The exchange spread through the academy faster than any official report. Humans did not argue dominance. They questioned stagnation. That unsettled species who had built their identity around unchanging order. Behind closed doors, the council convened again. This time, the data was undeniable. Wherever the human influenced outcomes, systems became more flexible. More unpredictable? Yes, but also more survivable. One counselor voiced what others had been circling around in silence. If this behavior propagates, control will decentralize. Authority will be challenged not by force, but by effectiveness. That was the real fear. Not rebellion, replacement. Another counselor countered with a colder observation. Control that cannot adapt deserves to fail. The statement was recorded, flagged, and quietly archived. It would matter later. The human was summoned once more, not to a tribunal, but to a briefing. No accusation this time, no test, just a statement of intent. The Academy would be introducing a new designation, not a rank, not a species category, but a functional role. Adaptive lead. It would be optional, unofficial, and extremely watched. The human understood immediately what that meant. They wanted to see if others would follow him when no one forced them to. They wanted to know if this was a human trait or a human effect. As he left the chamber, the scanner activated briefly. Behind him, running a passive sweep it had never used before. No warning, no display, just a silent recalculation. Somewhere deep in its layered logic, the word Deathworlder remained unchanged. But beneath it, a new annotation formed, one that had never existed in the system before. Potential catalyst species. And for the first time since the Academy was founded, the greatest uncertainty in the galaxy was not what humanity might destroy, but what it might change. The radar's blip had grown larger, a silent predator creeping closer with every heartbeat. I could feel the tension in the room. Even the normally calm night shift crew was holding their breath. My fingers hovered over the intercom, reluctant to speak first, as if announcing it would somehow summon disaster faster. The object was impossibly smooth, almost liquid in its motion, gliding toward the station without a sound or trail. I glanced at the control panels, everything normal. No emissions, no energy signature, nothing. It was as if it existed in its own space, ignoring all the laws we understood. A cold shiver ran down my spine, not of fear, but of an unshakable, creeping curiosity. Something about its presence felt personal, like it had been searching specifically for us. Then, without warning, the warning ping changed tone sharper, insistent, almost screaming. Lights on the console flickered in response. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the readings. My eyes widened. The object had adjusted its trajectory, no longer drifting slowly, but aiming directly at our station's main docking bay. The crew scrambled, murmuring rapid, nervous calculations. No one knew what it wanted, or if we were about to become the unwitting target of an intelligence beyond comprehension. I reached for the manual override, but my hand froze. Nothing in our training covered this. Not a single scenario in the simulation drills had prepared us for a presence that seemed alive, intelligent, and utterly indifferent to human expectation. The calm night I'd walked into hours ago had vanished, replaced by the tense hum of a station teetering on the edge of an unimaginable encounter. And then the intercom crackled a voice not human, whispering something so faint I couldn't understand, yet chillingly clear in its intent. "You are not ready."
The whisper lingered in the air, echoing in my mind long after the intercom went silent. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, each of us realizing that this was no ordinary encounter. Whatever was approaching had awareness, intelligence, maybe even intent. The massive object now filled the radar almost completely, and yet, outside the observation window, the void remained undisturbed. No impact, no shockwave, just the calm emptiness of space surrounding something that clearly was not empty. My heart pounded as I thought of the countless possibilities, hostile, benign, or something entirely beyond our comprehension. For a brief moment, a terrifying thought struck me. What if it had been watching us all along, studying our routines, our reactions, our weaknesses? Then the station shuddered. Just a small tremor, almost imperceptible, but enough to send objects sliding across the floor. The lights flickered again, and the emergency sirens wailed, a deafening, unrelenting warning that no one could ignore. Every eye in the room was glued to the main observation screen as the object moved closer, not violently, but with an unnerving inevitability. And then, as if acknowledging our gaze, it paused, suspended in the black expanse of space, enormous and unknowable. Time seemed to freeze, every second stretching into eternity. My fingers hovered over the comms again, desperate to speak, desperate to understand, but no words came. All at once, the object emitted a pulse, not a sound, not a light, but a sensation, a deep resonance that seemed to penetrate every nerve, every thought, every fear. I knew then, with a clarity that left me trembling, that we had crossed a threshold. Whatever this was, whatever had arrived, the world we had known would never be the same. And then, in the silence that followed, the screen went black.